5 days had passed since Danny Cole fell from the sky. He woke each morning before the twin suns rose above the hills. He worked until his muscles screamed and his hands bled. He fell asleep each night on the hard ground with clay dried into the lines of his skin. And slowly, brick by brick, his plan was becoming real. The first brick had been ugly. Danny remembered holding it up to the light and seeing all its flaws. The shape was uneven. The surface was cracked, but it was solid. It held together. It did not crumble like the poisoned wood from the Kethrani trees. That first brick had given him hope. Now he had 47 more just like it, lined up in neat rows along the riverbank, drying in the pale sunlight. The process was simple but exhausting. Danny dug clay from the riverbank using flat rocks as shovels. He carried it to a shallow pit he had dug nearby. He mixed it with water and chopped pieces of dried reeds, stomping the mixture with his bare feet until it reached the right texture. Then he pressed it into rectangular molds he had made from woven reeds. Finally, he laid the wet bricks in the sun and waited for them to dry. Each brick took about 2 days to cure properly. Danny had learned to rotate his work. While one batch dried, he would prepare the next. While the clay set, he would gather more reeds or hunt for fish in the river. He fell into a rhythm that kept him moving from sunrise to sunset. His body was changing. The soft edges of his former life as a colony engineer were disappearing. His arms grew thick from digging. His legs grew strong from walking. His skin turned dark from the constant sun. He was becoming something harder, something built for survival. Vethora watched all of this from his station in orbit. The Kethrani officer had stopped recording his usual predictions about when the human would die. Something was happening down there that he did not understand. The broadcasts had become unexpectedly popular across the collective. Viewers tuned in to watch the strange alien creature dig in the mud and shape little blocks from dirt. They made jokes about it at first. How primitive, how amusing. But as the days passed and the human kept working, the laughter grew quieter. Vethora had received 3 messages from the High Council asking for updates. He did not know what to tell them. The human was not behaving like prey. He was behaving like something else entirely. On the 6th day, Danny made a discovery that changed everything. He had been walking upstream, looking for deeper pools where bigger fish might hide, when he found the rocks. They were pale white and chalky, scattered along the riverbed like forgotten bones. Danny picked one up and examined it closely. His heart began to beat faster. Limestone, or something very close to it. Danny sat down on the riverbank and held the white rock in his shaking hands. He knew what this meant. With limestone, he could make mortar. Real mortar that would bind his bricks together into solid walls. Without it, his house would be nothing more than a pile of blocks that would fall over in the first strong wind. The process for making lime was ancient. His grandfather had shown him once, many years ago. You had to burn the limestone at very high temperatures until it turned to powder. Then you mixed the powder with water and sand to create a paste that would harden like stone. Danny gathered as many of the white rocks as he could carry and brought them back to his camp. He built a fire pit using dried reeds and spent the next 2 days feeding the flames with everything that would burn. The fire roared and crackled, sending sparks up into the night sky. The limestone glowed red and orange in the heart of the flames. On the morning of the 8th day, Danny raked aside the ashes and found what he was looking for. The rocks had changed. They were lighter now, crumbling easily into white powder at his touch. He had done it. He had created quicklime lime using nothing but rocks and fire. That afternoon, he mixed his first batch of mortar. He tested it by sticking 2 bricks together and waiting an hour. When he tried to pull them apart, they would not move. The mortar held them tight like they had grown together. Danny sat back and stared at his work. He had everything he needed now. Clay for bricks, reeds for reinforcement, lime for mortar. He could build something real, something permanent. Beth Ora noticed the moment the human's behavior changed. Before, the creature had moved with desperate energy, always rushing, always worried. Now he moved with confidence. He walked like someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he would do when he got there. The Kethrani officer felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen many species face exile on Vulcar 9. He had watched them panic and wander and slowly give up. He had never seen one look hopeful before. On the 9th night, the storm came. Danny had seen the dark clouds building on the horizon all day. He knew he did not have enough time to build real shelter. Instead, he dug a trench into the muddy embankment near the river, just deep enough to lie down in. He covered himself with woven reed mats and waited. The wind hit first. It screamed across the valley like a living thing, tearing at the ground and ripping plants from the soil. Then the rain came, falling so hard that Danny could barely breathe beneath his thin covering. Water filled his trench within minutes. He pressed himself against the mud and held on. The storm lasted 6 hours. Danny thought he might drown. He thought the wind might tear away his mats and leave him exposed to die. He thought about his wife back on the colony world and wondered if she knew he was still alive. But he did not die. The storm passed. The clouds broke apart and the twin suns appeared. Weak and pale but still warm, Danny crawled out of his trench and stood on shaking legs. He was covered head to toe in mud. Every part of his body hurt. But he was alive. He walked to where his bricks were drying and stopped. A slow smile spread across his face. The bricks had survived. Some had been scattered by the wind, but none of them had broken. They lay there in the morning light, solid and strong, waiting for him to pick them up and start building. High above, Beth Ora leaned back from his screen. For the first time in 12 cycles of overseeing this program, he did not know what would happen next. And that uncertainty frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The human was supposed to be dead by now. Instead, he was building. The dropship opened its doors 300 feet above the ground. Danny Cole had just enough time to see the brown and orange landscape rushing toward him before he hit the water. The river saved his life. That was probably not what the Kethrani wanted. He came up gasping, his lungs burning from the impact. The cold water shocked his body awake as he kicked toward the shore. Behind him, he heard the dropship's engines roar as it climbed back into the gray sky. He did not bother to look up. He already knew they were not coming back. Danny pulled himself onto the muddy riverbank and lay there for a long moment, breathing hard. His thin jumpsuit was soaked through. It was the only thing he owned now. The Kethrani had taken everything else. His tools, his equipment, his wedding ring, everything that might help him survive on this dead world, Vulcar 9. He had heard stories about this place during his time in the Kethrani holding cells. The other prisoners spoke of it in whispers. It was not a prison planet. It was worse than that. It was an entertainment program. The Kethrani dropped their captives here with nothing and watched them die. They broadcast the whole thing across their empire as a warning to other species. This is what happens when you resist the collective. Danny sat up slowly and looked around. The landscape was empty and harsh. Rocky hills rose in the distance under a sky the color of dirty metal. Two pale suns hung low on the horizon, giving weak light but little warmth. The river cut through a valley of red dirt and strange plants that looked like a mix of bamboo and tall grass. He could see the trees the other prisoners had warned him about. They grew in scattered groups across the hills. They looked normal enough from here. But Danny knew the truth. The Kethrani had changed them at the genetic level. If you cut one down, the wood would crumble to dust within hours. You could not build anything from them. You could not even burn them properly. The aliens had thought of everything. Or so they believed. Danny stood up and started walking along the riverbank. His body hurt from the fall, but nothing seemed broken. He needed to move. He needed to think. He needed to find something the Kethrani had missed. Far above the planet, in an orbital station that looked like a black metal spider, a Kethrani officer named Vethora watched the human on his display screen. Vethora had overseen the exile program for 12 cycles now. He had watched hundreds of prisoners die on Vulcar 9. Most of them lasted 3 or 4 days. The strong ones sometimes made it a full week. But they all died eventually. The humans were a new addition to the program. The collective had only recently encountered their species during the expansion into the outer territories. They were soft creatures. Weak. They had no claws, no armored skin, no natural weapons of any kind. Vethora expected this one to die faster than most. He settled back in his chair and began recording his observations for the broadcast. The viewers across the Empire would enjoy watching another primitive species prove its weakness. Down on the surface, Danny had stopped walking. He was kneeling by the river's edge, looking at something in the mud. His hands were dirty. He was digging. Vethora leaned forward slightly. What was the human doing? Danny pulled up a handful of thick red clay. He squeezed it between his fingers, watching how it held its shape. A small smile crossed his face for the first time since his capture. The Kethrani had destroyed all the caves on this planet. They had blasted away every natural shelter. They had poisoned the trees so their wood was useless. They had removed every obvious option for building anything. But they had not thought about the dirt. Danny looked up at the gray sky and laughed quietly. The sound surprised him. He had not expected to laugh ever again. But here he was, holding a fistful of clay, and suddenly, things did not seem quite so hopeless. He knew about clay. His grandfather had been a builder in the old style, back on Earth. Danny had spent his childhood summers learning how to make bricks from nothing but mud and water and sunshine. His grandfather had called it the oldest technology in human history. Thousands of years ago, before metal and plastic and concrete, humans had built entire cities from clay bricks. The Kethrani might have advanced spacecraft and genetic engineering, but they had clearly never bothered to study ancient construction methods. Danny spent the rest of the day exploring the riverbank. He found exactly what he hoped to find. The bamboo-like reeds grew thick and tall along the water's edge. When he broke one open, he found it was strong and flexible. It would work perfectly for reinforcement. He also found flat rocks that would be useful for shaping and cutting. And everywhere he looked, there was more clay. Mountains of it just sitting in the ground, waiting to be dug up. As the twin suns began to set, Danny sat down and began to plan. He would need to find food and water first. The river would handle the water problem. He had seen small fish swimming in the shallows. They would keep him alive while he worked on the bigger project. The bigger project. Danny almost laughed again at the thought. He was going to build a house. Right here on this dead world where he was supposed to die for the entertainment of aliens. He was going to dig up their dirt and turn it into bricks and stack those bricks into walls and put a roof over his head. The Kethrani had taken away every shelter option. They have been very clever about it. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that shelter was something you found. They did not understand that humans could create shelter from almost anything. Give a human some mud and some sticks and some time, and he would build something. It was what humans did. It was what they had always done, ever since the first. Members of their species had crawled out of the caves and looked up at the stars. Danny kneeled by the river as darkness fell. He scooped up another handful of red clay and pressed it between his palms. Tomorrow he would start making bricks. Tomorrow he would begin building something that would prove the Kethrani wrong about his species. He looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, an alien was watching him and waiting for him to die. Danny smiled. He planned to disappoint them. 3 weeks after his fall from the sky, Danny Cole stood before something that looked like a home. The walls were not beautiful. They were rough and uneven, made from bricks of different sizes pressed together with crude mortar. The corners did not quite meet properly. The surface was patched in several places where early mistakes had crumbled away. But the walls stood firm. They did not fall. They did not break. Danny had built them himself, one brick at a time, one layer at a time. He had started with a simple rectangle, about 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, small enough to heat with his body in the cold nights, large enough to move around inside. He had left openings for a door and a single window, facing the river so he could watch for danger. Now he was working on the roof. This was the hardest part. The reed bundles were strong, but they were not waterproof. The first heavy rain would soak through and flood his shelter. Danny needed something to seal the gaps between the reeds. He found the answer by accident. There were insects on Vulcan 9. Small, crawling things that lived in colonies beneath the rocks along the riverbank. Danny had noticed them before but paid little attention. They seemed harmless. They did not bite or sting. They simply went about their business, building tiny tunnels through the soil. One morning, Danny lifted a rock and found something strange. The insects had created a substance that looked like dried honey. It coated the walls of their tunnels in thick amber layers. When Danny touched it, he found it was hard and smooth. When he pressed his finger against it, water beat it up and rolled away. The insect resin was waterproof. Danny spent the next 3 days carefully harvesting the substance. He used a flat stick to scrape it from the tunnel walls, collecting it in a hollow stone. The insects did not seem to mind. They simply rebuilt their tunnels after he left. Soon he had enough resin to coat the entire roof. The finished roof was a strange thing to look at. Bundles of reeds tied together with fiber rope, covered in a layer of amber goo that hardened in the sun like glass. But when Danny tested it by pouring water from the river, not a single drop came through. He had built a shelter. A real shelter, on a planet designed to make shelter impossible. Veth-Aura's broadcasts had become the most watched program in the collective. Millions of viewers tuned in each day to watch the human work. They watched him dig clay and shape bricks. They watched him climb on his walls and lay more layers. They watched him crawl across his roof, spreading insect resin with his bare hands. Some viewers found it boring. They complained in the comments that nothing exciting was happening. Where was the suffering? Where was the death? But others were asking different questions. How did the human know to do these things? Where did he learn such strange skills? And if one human could survive on Vulcan 9, could others do the same? These questions made the High Council very nervous. On the 23rd day, another dropship appeared in the sky above Danny's camp. Danny was on his roof when he heard the engines. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. Another prisoner was coming. The Kethrani were sending someone else to die. The ship did not bother to slow down. It opened its doors at the same height as before, and a figure tumbled out and fell toward the river. Danny watched the splash and then ran toward the water. He pulled her out of the river before she could drown. She was younger than him, maybe late 20s, with short dark hair and wide frightened eyes. She coughed up water and stared at Danny like he was a ghost. Her name was Katie Price. She had been a xenobiologist on a research station near the border. The Kethrani had captured her when they raided the station 3 months ago. She had spent weeks in their holding cells, waiting for her turn to die. When Danny led her to his shelter, she stopped and stared at the clay walls. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She touched the bricks with trembling fingers. She looked at the roof and the window and the door. Then she looked at Danny and asked a simple question. How? Danny spent the rest of the day explaining. He showed her the clay deposits by the river. He showed her the lime pit where he burned limestone. He showed her the reeds and the insect colonies and the fish traps he had built in the shallow water. He taught her everything his grandfather had taught him, and a few things he had learned on his own. Katie listened carefully. She was a scientist, trained to observe and analyze. She saw patterns that Danny had missed. She pointed to plants along the riverbank that Danny had ignored. "Those are edible," she said. "That one, the purple one, has roots that taste like potatoes. And the tall green one produces seeds that can be ground into flour." Danny stared at her. He had been eating nothing but fish for 3 weeks. His body was starving for nutrients. And the answer had been growing all around him the whole time. That night, they ate a real meal. Roasted fish with mashed purple roots and flatbread made from seed flour cooked on hot stones. It was the best thing Danny had tasted since leaving Earth. They sat inside his shelter as darkness fell. The walls blocked the cold wind. The roof kept out the evening dew. For the first time since arriving on Velker 9, Danny felt almost comfortable. Katie looked around at the rough brick walls and shook her head in amazement that the Kethrani thought they were so clever, she said. They took away every option for shelter. They never imagined someone would just make new options. Danny nodded. He was already thinking about tomorrow. With 2 people, they could work twice as fast. They could build a bigger shelter. They could gather more food. They could survive longer, but more than that, they could build something the Kethrani never expected. Not just a shelter, a home. High above in orbit, Vethora watched the 2 humans sit together in their little clay box. He had received new orders from the High Council that morning. They were not happy with how the broadcasts were going. They wanted something done. Vethora was to send more humans. They expected the growing population to fight over limited resources. They expected conflict and death, and all the entertainment that came with it. He scheduled the next drop for 1 week from today. 3. More humans would fall from the sky. Vethora was certain. This would finally break them. 2 months had passed since Danny Cole first touched the red clay of Velker 9. The small shelter by the river was no longer alone. 3 more buildings stood nearby, their walls made from the same crude bricks, their roofs sealed with the same amber resin. Smoke rose from fire pits between the structures. The sound of voices carried across the valley for the first time in thousands of years. 5 humans now lived on the planet, where none were supposed to survive. Bantoras had arrived first, falling from the dropship exactly 1 week after Katie. He was older than the others, somewhere in his 50s, with weathered skin and calloused hands. Before the Kethrani took him, he had been a farmer on a colony world near the outer rim. He knew things about growing food that even Katie had never learned. Amy Lynn came 2 days later. She was small and quiet, but her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. She had been a medic on a transport ship before her capture. She knew how to treat wounds, how to identify infections, and how to use plants as medicine. Within a week of arriving, she had set up a small medical station using materials Katie helped her gather. Chris Grant was the last to fall. He was young, barely 22, with a quick smile that seemed strange on a death world. He had been a teacher at a colony school. He had no practical skills for survival, he admitted on his first day. But he could learn, and more importantly, he could teach others what he learned. The Kethrani had expected these 5 humans to fight. Resources were limited on Velker 9. There was only so much clay, only so many fish, only so many edible plants. The natural response, according to Kethrani science, was competition. The strong would take from the weak. Alliances would form and break. Eventually, they would turn on each other. But that was not what happened. Danny organized them on the first day. He gathered everyone together and explained what they were going to do. They would share everything. They would work together. Each person would contribute what they could. No one would be left behind. Ben immediately took charge of food production. He studied the local plants that Katie had identified and figured out how to grow them deliberately instead of just gathering wild ones. He dug irrigation channels from the river to small fields he created near the shelters. He planted seeds and tended shoots and created something that looked almost like a farm. Amy set up her medical station in a corner of Katie's shelter. She made bandages from woven reeds. She created salves from plant oils. She treated Danny's infected hand wound and Ben's bad back and the strange rash that Chris developed after touching the wrong plant. Small problems that could have become deadly were solved before they grew serious. Chris did what teachers do. He watched and listened and asked questions. He learned how to make bricks from Danny. He learned about plants from Katie. He learned about farming from Ben. He learned about medicine from Amy. Then he started writing everything down, scratching notes onto flat stones with a sharp rock. He was creating a record of everything they knew, so nothing would be forgotten. The broadcasts had become a problem for the Kethrani High Council. Millions of viewers across the collective were watching the humans work together. They saw the shelters rise from the mud. They saw the fields begin to grow. They saw 5 creatures from a primitive species doing something that no other exile had ever done. They saw them winning. Vethora was summoned to appear before the council. The meeting did not go well. The council members demanded to know how this had happened. They accused Vethora of manipulating the broadcasts. They threatened him with exile himself if he could not explain why the humans were not dead. Vethora had no good answers. He could only report what he observed. The humans were different from other species. They did not compete when resources were low. They cooperated. They did not fight when threatened. They organized. They did not give up when conditions were harsh. They adapted. The council made a decision. If the planet would not kill the humans, something else would. 3 days later, Kethrani ships descended to the far side of Vulcar 9 and released a cargo of predators. The creatures were called Vorn in the Kethrani language. They were large, fast, and hungry. They hunted in packs. They could track prey by smell across great distances. They had been used before to clean up exile populations that survived too long. Danny heard them for the first time that night. The howling started after sunset, somewhere in the hills beyond the river. It was a sound unlike anything Danny had heard before. High and sharp, it cut through the darkness like a blade. Other howls answered from different directions. The pack was spreading out, surrounding the area. Danny gathered everyone in the largest shelter. The 5 humans sat in the flickering firelight and listened to the sounds outside. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Ben broke the silence. He said what everyone was thinking. Those things out there were hunters. Sooner or later, they would find the camp. The shelters could keep out wind and rain, but they could not stop a pack of hungry predators. Amy suggested they could fight. Maybe they could make weapons from sharpened rocks and hard wood. Chris shook his head. They did not know how many creatures were out there. They did not know how strong they were. Fighting blind was a good way to die. Katie looked at Danny. She asked what he was thinking. Danny was quiet for a moment. He looked at the clay walls around him. He thought about his grandfather and the stories the old man used to tell about ancient humans. Long ago, before cities and technology, humans had faced the same problem. They were soft and weak, surrounded by predators that wanted to eat them. They could not run faster or fight harder. So they found another way. They built walls, not just around one house. Around all of them, Danny looked at the 4 humans gathered in his shelter. Their faces were tired and scared in the firelight. But he also saw something else there. He saw people who had survived everything the Kethrani had thrown at them. People who had learned and adapted and refused to die. He told them what they needed to do. They would build a wall around the entire camp. It would be tall enough that the predators could not jump over. It would be thick enough that they could not break through. It would take weeks of hard work. But they could do it. Ben said they would need a lot more bricks. Katie said they would need to find more clay deposits. Amy said she would prepare extra medical supplies for the injuries. That would come. Chris said he would keep recording everything, so future survivors would know how to protect themselves. Danny nodded. They would start at first light. Outside, the howling continued through the night. The predators were out there circling in the darkness, waiting for their chance. They did not know it yet, but they had already lost. 6 months after Danny Cole fell from the sky, a Kethrani shuttle descended toward Velker 9. Inside, Veth pressed his face against the viewing window and tried to understand what he was seeing. Pressed his face against the viewing window and tried to understand what he was seeing. Wall circled the human camp. It was 12 feet tall and 3 feet thick, made from thousands of clay bricks sealed with mortar. Guard towers stood at each corner, built from the same materials, rising another 6 feet above the wall. Inside the protected area, smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Green fields spread out in neat rows near the river. Figures moved between buildings, carrying tools and materials. It looked like a village. A real village, growing and thriving on a planet designed for death. Veth had watched the humans build this place, day by day, through his screens in orbit. But watching from above was nothing compared to seeing it from the ground. The scale of it hit him in a way he was not prepared for. These creatures had arrived with nothing. No tools, no supplies, no shelter. And they had created this. The shuttle landed outside the main gate. Veth stepped out, flanked by 2 armed guards. He stood there for a moment, looking at the wall that towered above him. Then the gate opened. Danny Cole walked out to meet him. The human looked nothing like the weak creature Veth had watched fall into the river 6 months ago. His body was lean and strong. His skin was dark from the twin suns. His eyes held something that Veth had never seen in an exile before. Confidence. Behind Danny, more humans appeared. 12 of them now, each arriving on the dropships that Veth had sent. Each one was supposed to increase the competition for resources. Each one was supposed to make survival harder. Instead, each one had been welcomed into the community and put to work. Veth demanded to know how this was possible. His voice came out sharper than he intended. He was used to watching dying creatures beg for mercy. He was not used to being the one who felt small. Danny invited him inside. They walked through the gate and into the compound. Veth guards followed close behind, their weapons ready. But there was no danger here. Just humans going about their daily work. A woman was grinding seeds into flour near a clay oven. A man was teaching 3 others how to weave reed baskets. Children's laughter came from somewhere nearby. The first generation born on Vale K or -9. Danny led Veth to the largest building in the compound. It was a community hall, big enough to hold everyone at once. A fire burned in a stone chimney at one end. The walls were decorated with scratched images showing the history of the settlement. The first brick, the first shelter, the first harvest. The day the wall was completed, Veth stood in the middle of the hall and looked around. His species would have died in days on this planet. They were not built for survival without technology. They needed their tools, their ships, their comfortable habitats. Take those away, and they would simply lie down and accept their fate. He asked Danny the question that had been burning in his mind for months. How did humans do this? How did they survive when everything was taken from them? Danny thought about the question for a long moment. Then he told Vethora a story. Long ago, on the human home world, there was a time before cities, before tools made of metal, before even the most basic technologies. Humans were soft and weak, just like Vethora had observed. They had no claws or fangs. They could not run as fast as the predators that hunted them. They could not hide as well as smaller creatures. By every measure, they should have gone extinct, but they did not. They learned to work together. They learned to make tools from rocks and sticks. They learned to build shelters from whatever materials they could find. Most importantly, they learned that survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about refusing to give up. Humans had spent thousands of years as prey. They had evolved to survive in conditions that should have killed them. They had learned to look at any environment and find a way to make it home. This was not a skill that could be removed. It was built into what they were. Taking away shelter did not defeat humans, Danny said. It reminded them of who they were. Vethora listened in silence. He thought about the broadcasts that had gone out across the collective. Millions of viewers had watched these humans build their settlement brick by brick. They had seen cooperation instead of competition. They had seen creation instead of destruction. They had seen something that challenged everything the Kethrani believed about primitive species. The exile program was finished. Vethora knew this even before he received the official message from the High Council 3 days later. The broadcasts had created too much sympathy for the humans. Other species were asking uncomfortable questions. Why were the Kethrani treating prisoners this way? What did it say about the collective that they entertained themselves by watching people die? The program was discontinued quietly. No announcement. No explanation. The broadcast simply stopped, and the orbital station was reassigned to other duties. A month later, a Kethrani diplomatic vessel arrived at Velkarnine. They came with an offer. Transportation off the planet for all humans. Resettlement on a proper colony world. Medical care. Supplies. Everything they needed to start over somewhere else. Danny gathered everyone together in the community hall to discuss the offer. They talked for hours. Some wanted to leave. They missed their families, their old lives, the comforts they had lost. Others were not so sure. In the end, the vote was nearly unanimous. They would stay. This was their home now. They had built it with their own hands from nothing. They had fought the planet and the predators and the system that was designed to kill them. They had won. They were not going to walk away from that. More humans would come in the following months. Some were former exiles from other Kethrani programs, freed when the system was shut down. Others were refugees and outcasts, looking for a place where they belonged. The settlement grew from 12 to 50 to over 100. Danny watched it all happen with a quiet sense of wonder. He thought about his grandfather often. The old man had died long before humans ever left Earth. But somehow his knowledge had traveled across the galaxy to save lives on a world he never could have imagined. 1 year after his arrival, Danny walked to the main gate to greet a new ship of arrivals. A hand-carved wooden sign now stood at the entrance to the compound. Katie had suggested the words. Ben had carved them into the wood. Amy had painted them with pigments made from local plants. Chris had recorded the moment in his ever-growing history of the settlement. The sign said, "Too simple." Words. Welcome home. Danny stood beneath that sign and watched the new arrivals step off the ship. They looked tired and scared, just as he had looked when he first crawled out of the river. But their eyes went wide when they saw the walls and the buildings and the fields of green. They saw the impossible made real. Danny smiled and stepped forward to greet them. There was work to do. There were houses to build, and there was always room for more.